Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, first reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribe, rated, and reviewed us, 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd love it, too, if you shared the show within your orbit. And one more point of housekeeping. Yes, indeed, we are on YouTube, so do check us out right there. All right. Now, to share perspective on the Israel-Iran war, Gregg Roman joins us on this episode of the program. Gregg is the executive director of the Middle East Forum, previously directing the Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. In 2014, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency named him one of the 10 most inspiring global Jewish leaders, and I have to agree with that. He previously served as the political advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel and worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Our frequent speaker on Middle East affairs, Gregg appears on international news channels like Fox News, I-24 News, Al Jazeera, BBC World News, and Israel's channels 12 and 13. He's contributed to The Hill, Newsweek, the Los Angeles Times, the Miami Herald, the Jerusalem Post, and so many other publications. He studied national security and political communications at American University and the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. And with that, Gregg Roman joins us now via Zoom from the city of brotherly love. Yes, Philadelphia, PA. Welcome to IsraelCast, Gregg. So great to have you join us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, we should first share with our dear listeners and viewers that we are recording this episode on Thursday, June 19th. The episode will be released on Wednesday, June 25th, so the world can and will likely change these next few days, if not in the next few hours. So we do want to get that out of the way before we begin the conversation. And I really do want to first start by asking you, Gregg, really to share in broad brushstrokes what Israel has already accomplished mission-wise in Iran.
This is a war that has been 46 years in the making, and that Israel has been planning since at least 2007. The target banks having been enumerated starting from 1998 and 1999, with the Iranian nuclear weapons program really taking full drive then. But in terms of its successes, Israel has been able to strike, as of today, Thursday, June 19th, over 1,000 targets in Iran associated with their nuclear program, their ballistic missiles program, the leadership of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's propaganda outlets, and many other military targets that have been the core of the Iranian three-pronged strategy of trying to threaten the Jewish state, including its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, and its ability to sponsor terror proxies throughout the region.
And so when they took out their defensive capabilities several months back, was that part of this larger program, this larger plan?
I think that was a dress rehearsal for what you've seen since last Thursday, June 13th, when you had in April of 2024, the first Israeli strike, which was on one anti-air missile launcher in Isfahan, outside one of their enrichment facilities, the S-300 anti-air missile system that the Russians provided, demonstrating that they could get beyond Iran's air defense array and be able to take out one launcher. Then, in October of 2024, they went after the entire aerial defense array, striking most of their major significant sites around other Iranian nuclear sites and Iranian IRGC sites. So they essentially paved an aerial superhighway in October, which let them have not just the element of surprise, but of aerial superiority since the beginning of this operation, 7 months before its commencement.
And listen, Gregg, we invite all our listeners and viewers in earshot to log on to iranwarmonitor.com as well as meforum.org and share with everybody what they can expect there.
Sure. So if you're just in the mood to read about this one time a day and not be overwhelmed by the news coming out of the region, you can go to iranwarmonitor.com, which provides an updated battle damage assessment, what actually is happening in terms of Israeli Air Force jets and other weapons that they're using to take out the nuclear missile and proxy program to be able to get that sort of one-day digest. But if you're more inclined for live news updates, analysis, and resources that you can use, not just to stay informed about what's going on, but also how you can take action to support Israel and the United States in their effort to weaken the Iranian nuclear program, you can also go to meforum.org, which is up to date as of the minute that news breaks and analysis comes out.
Greg, how close was Iran to a nuclear weapon before the strikes? Can you sort of clarify all that?
Sure, we have to crystallize four separate assessments from three different countries to be able to accurately answer that question. First, let's not start with the United States or Israel, but let's start with the intelligence agencies for Austria. About 3 weeks ago, Austria and its intelligence agency issues an annual threat report. And in that report delivered to Austria's parliament in Vienna, they estimated that the Iranian nuclear program was on its way to becoming weaponized. This is an American or Israeli source, this is a European source coming to that conclusion. It was then further backed up by an estimate that the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, which is part of the Pentagon and the Defense Department, issued at the beginning of May, saying that Iran was 1 week away from a breakout capacity to being able to build a nuclear device. This is in stark contrast to the National Intelligence Office, led by Tulsi Gabbard, that said that the Ayatollah and the Iranian government was not pursuing a nuclear device. A quick change of assessment, 6 weeks between its delivery to Congress and then its release by the DIA. But the two most important analyses as it relates to Iran's nuclear weapons program first came out from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, last Monday in a report which was then voted on to find Iran in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, saying that Iran's components that they had been developing for its nuclear program had no civilian element, thereby showing that they were making advances as related to a non-civilian component. And then you can crystallize all of this and really put all these three bits of information together with Israel's assessment, which showed 5 different elements of the nuclear fuel cycle and the ability to create a detonated device, or a device that can be detonated, which was one, the establishment of an explosives line, which is required for connecting the explosives with fissile material. It's what allows the nuclear device to go off. 2 was a shaping charge, which was being put into place at Parchin, which is an IRGC site where they were weaponizing their nuclear materials. And also 3 other elements in terms of Natanz and enrichment, Fordo and enrichment, and also the ability to recycle spent nuclear fuel rods to be able to get to that 90% enriched capacity for uranium, which is the only indicator that it could be used for a weaponized device. So those 4 things together really gave Israel the information, I think, to justify its strike, but also according to the diplomatic window. This isn't just about the technological or the manufacturing of a nuclear device, but Israel waited until day 61 of President Trump's 60-day deadline to carry out this attack, because that was indicative that the Iranians were not abiding by U.S. set diplomatic framework. And in doing so, the combination of policy and then its intelligence assessment led the Prime Minister Netanyahu and his security cabinet to make the decision to strike.
I want to pick up on that National Intelligence Office estimate from Tulsi Gabbard. Can you just do a little bit more of a deep dive? Why did she come out and say that there wasn't the threat assessment that everyone else was saying that there was?
Sure. So this is just an analysis, not necessarily based on inside information. But when the first intelligence estimate came out by the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, in March of this year, I think it was largely based off of information that may have been collected and processed during the Biden administration. And the priorities that were given by the intelligence community from policymakers prior to President Trump coming into office may have not been looking at all the threats that they otherwise should have been in terms of assessing Iran's nuclear program and its military dimensions. 6 weeks later, after the issuance of President Trump's National Presidential Security Memorandum number 2, which asked the intelligence community to do a reassessment of all available information, the beginning of the diplomatic talks, the chicanery of the Iranian government relating to trying to fool Special Envoy Witkoff and others, may have led the DIA to have a reassessment with its one report, but we haven't necessarily seen other reports coming from the 17 other members of the intelligence community. But if you pay close attention to President Trump's statements that he's made since he was at the G7 in Canada on around June 15th, through the assessment and statements that he's made this morning on June 19th, he may concur, and I think if you read between the lines of his messages, that he believes that Iran was on its way to a nuclear weapon.
And where does Tulsi Gabbard fit into all of this? And what does she believe then?
Well, she made an assessment that came out yesterday saying that she backed the president's words
Okay.
after he had a stark disagreement with her on Air Force One, responding to a question from a reporter about her assessment. But again, that's stale intelligence from 3 months ago.
Okay.
I think it's a little irresponsible for policymakers on the Hill who are trying this as a talking point, journalists who are saying that, well, Tulsi Gabbard thought one thing and now the president's saying something else. There's a quarter of a year between her statement and what's developing right now.
Yeah.
So I think that she's in line with the president's decision making now. She's affirmed that in a public statement. And I think that the U.S. National Security Council, members of the Intelligence Committee, and others are in lockstep in backing whatever decision the president makes, whether it's to strike Iran or to not strike Iran. And I know this is coming out next week, but you can assume that if the president makes the decision to strike Iran between this time and when this podcast is broadcast, it's because he's acting on updated information from the intelligence community, from the defense community, and his belief, based on his information, not Israeli information, that it's time to stop the possibility for there to be the militarization of the Iranian nuclear weapons project.
And I appreciate your clarifying that because, again, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding in the media. And so I really just wanted to get the record straight on that. So thank you for sharing that. Well, listen, on May 24th, 2025, so this year, you penned a piece, Days Not Weeks, Israel's imminent attack on Iranian nuclear sites. Talk about what led you to that conclusion, particularly the letter. This I thought was very interesting when I read the article, the letter written by the Iranian foreign minister to the United Nations Secretary General in the IAEA.
Right. So that letter, starting off the wider analysis, was an indicator that if the international community asked for increased oversight of Iran's nuclear program, and this is on the backdrop of them increasing their enrichment to around 80%, they're building more centrifuges for Natanz and for Fordow, 4 undeclared sites being part of the nuclear program that the IAEA did not have access to and were demanding access to in terms of nuclear inspections, all coming to the vote, which took place last week, the week of June 7th to June 14th. And all this information coming to the head. And the foreign minister says to the UN, you better not increase inspections. You better not find us in violation of the non-proliferation treaty, because if you do, we may pull out of it. And the only reason that Iran would be against increased inspections is because they may have had something to hide. So that, along with the intelligence estimates that we spoke about earlier in the interview, combined with the general idea that the Iranians were dragging their feet, led me coming into an event that we ran in Washington, D.C., that the Middle East Forum ran in Washington, D.C. on May 23rd, to have this suspicion that the Iranians were right at breakout capacity to developing a nuclear weapon, or at least a fissile device, maybe a dirty bomb, maybe a radiological device. And we're talking a big difference here, because what Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if we go back to the first use of nuclear weapons, required was only about like 60% enrichment. We're talking about a modern nuclear device that they were marching towards. And we gathered in Washington, D.C. It's about 45 of Middle East Forum's staff, our fellows, Iran experts, former members of the U.S. and Israeli National Security Councils, all in one room. And we were given the opportunity for weeks before that to study the public statements and the actions taken by governments who would be affected by such a decision. We role-played how the UAE might affect this, how China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United Nations, the United States, and Iran would all be seeing such a scenario. And we took 7 hours to walk through a 2-month process between the Iranians being in violation of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, all the way to the possibility of the Iranians detonating a device. And over this 7-hour scenario, seeing all these different opinions of experts who know Iran, who know the actions of U.S. Middle East policy, who know how the Israeli government thinks, I came to the conclusion as sort of an after-action report that Iran was on its way to march to a bomb. And in doing so, you have to take Israeli policymakers seriously that they were deciding to carry out a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities.
Got it. I want to turn to the Mossad and the IDF because they've really worked fist and glove in pulling off what we've seen. And I'm wondering if you can just reflect on that.
Sure, there's always been an amount of healthy competition and tension between the Mossad and Israel. The Mossad being charged with global defense of the Jewish state, global intelligence collection and cooperation, and the Israeli army with its long arm directorate, which was kind of folded in to the regular general staff earlier this year, being responsible for regional defense. So if you take the human and signal intelligence outlets of the Israeli army, that's Unit 504 for human military intelligence and Unit 8200, which was responsible for signals intelligence. They have their parallel arms in the Civilian Aid Intelligence Agency of Israel, the Mossad. But as it relates to cooperation on the Iran matter, I think there's been deep cooperation between the Army and the intelligence agencies, especially since David Barnea, the head of Mossad, has come into his position. And they've really worked well together since October 7th, creating interagency cooperation, interdefense cooperation as part of Israel's overarching umbrella National Security Council. So, what was required here was Mossad assets that have, according to public reports, been in Iran as early as 2007, laying the groundwork to take out key sites that would be vulnerable prior to an Israeli aerial attack against Iran. There were drones, which were launched out of the backs of trucks, sort of harkening back a few weeks ago to Ukraine's SBU, their special bureau, which was responsible for an attack that eliminated 35 to 40% of Russia's strategic bomber capability. You had on the ground assassinations of missiles not just being launched at aerial defense units, but also at key points where Iranian leadership was located. You know, the Mossad was allegedly behind an attack on multiple members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that were at their home sleeping by being able to get to the window of their bedroom and then to use a drone with an explosive device attached to take out that key leadership. But I think the best instance of cooperation, an example of the Mossad and the IDF working together, was the way in which the Israeli security organs were able to fool the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Aerospace Command into setting up a meeting at their emergency command bunker, which Israel had knowledge of, by having a false phone call go to the leaders of this to indicate that Israel was on the precipice of a strike prior to the aircraft even taking off. And then when they gathered there, by virtue of the Mossad discovering where the location was, the Israeli Air Force was able to bomb it, thereby decapitating the command and control structure for the IRGC's response mechanism to an Israeli airstrike against the Iranian nuclear facilities. So there's a deep level of cooperation. There's a story that's going to be told about this years from now, akin to Operation Wrath of God or other exploits, the Beeper operation, whatever else. But this was the Mossad and the IDF working in lockstep, using operational synergy to repeat the successes that unfortunately had to be carried out after the October 7th massacre. Just another notch in the Israeli security establishment's belt, but probably not the last.
Greg, I can't wait to see the movie. Can you talk also about the drone camp? I mean, that blows my mind.
So the Mossad allegedly set up different drone manufacturing facilities throughout Iran, not just in Tehran, where they rented warehouse, they rented machine shops. They were setting up bases ran by the Mossad in areas next to key Iranian nuclear facilities, IRGC, and military installations, where they were able to smuggle in parts by suitcases going through Tehran airport, through Mashhad airport, through Avaz and other areas. They were able to smuggle it in across the Iraqi border, the Azeri border, the Armenian border through Pakistan. And in doing so, bringing in different components needed to assemble these drones, some of which may have even come from China that had civilian capacity, but then were weaponized. They were able to set up these staging points to then use when they were launching these attacks. But it wasn't just drones. There was even surface-to-surface missiles that Israel was able to smuggle in, anti-tank missiles and other types of equipment that we probably won't even find out about until it's declassified 75 years from now, that they were able to use to have a first strike capability against Iran's defenses.
Just extraordinary. Following the October 7th attack, people in the region and indeed the rest of the world questioned Israel's intelligence capabilities. In other words, how did they let October 7th happen? And has Israel then, do you think, really redeemed itself on the intelligence front based on what they've pulled off now in Iran?
I think Israel's greatest threat in the way in which the defense establishment of the country has seen itself has been a repeat of strategic failures that have been in cycles through about five or six different iterations. If you look at its defense posture in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, it thought that a physical barrier could prevent the Egyptian army from coming into the Sinai Peninsula because it had built something that was so high with the Bar-Lev line that it would stop the ability for an advancing Egyptian army to overwhelm IDF forces, even though the opposite happened. And then Israel's reliance on a military intervention in 1982 in Lebanon showed that it didn't have a successful counterterrorism strategy. Its inability to deal with the Second Intifada until it found a military solution to a counterterrorism operation, thereby going back against the lessons it learned in 82. It being surprised in 2006 with Hezbollah's capabilities. There's this sort of a mantra in Israeli defense establishment that Israel is always preparing for the last war, but not for the next one. And that's what showed on October 7th. Israel relied on an underground barrier to stop to stop tunnels. It relied on the Iron Dome system to stop rockets, but it didn't have that human component, thinking that just a motley group of 5,000 Hamas terrorists wouldn't be able to breach the border because it had cameras set up. As soon as the technological wall, much like the Bar-Lev line in 73, was overwhelmed, that led to the massacre. But Israel, in terms of it being farsighted in looking at its threats, overlooked Hamas as a threat, but has always seen Iran as the ultimate enemy, with Hezbollah and Hamas being the penultimate enemies. And because Israel has had a disproportionate amount of its defense resources focused on Iran, I think that in this case, the worst thing that could happen is Israel might be over-prepared for an Iran-Israel conflict. It had its targeting packages ready. It had its people on the ground. It's prepared for 2 weeks. The one issue that it may not be ready for, which I do understand that it is adjusting right now, is defining its war goals. What's the purpose of Israel launching this strike? Eliminating the nuclear program makes sense. Getting rid of the ballistic missile capabilities also makes sense. They're preparing for that for decades. But now there's a third and a fourth element. The third, which was defined on June 17th by the Prime Minister in a press conference, where he added the goal of having Iran stopping funding, arming, and providing support to its terror proxies in the Middle East. This is a new goal that was not enunciated at the beginning of the operation. And this morning, after the bombing of Soroka Hospital and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange and other civilian targets following on the horrible tragedies in Bat Yam, and Cholon, and Herzliya, and Haifa, the Prime Minister and Defense Minister have started to talk about regime change in Iran. But this wouldn't be one in which Israel has troops on the ground, boots on the ground in Iran. There's no way you'll have more than a special operations contingent taking control or occupying Iranian territory. Even if the U.S. gets involved, you should not expect American troops on the ground in Iran. But what Israel can do, and I'm not sure if they have, but they perhaps have started the development of non-kinetic coercion. And you've seen this in the last few days on June 16th, 17th, and 18th. On the 16th, ATM machines in the central bank in Iran went down. On the 17th, Sapa Bank, which is the main bank for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, was shut down and their accounts are inaccessible. On the 18th, Norditek, which is the main cryptocurrency exchange for Iran that's located in Iran, lost over $98 million in assets in Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other stablecoin by a allegedly Israel-aligned hacking group called Predatory Sparrow that was able to take that cryptocurrency out and flood it out to the rest of the market, thereby making it not capable of retrieving those assets back. I think the biggest instance of psychological warfare and information operations that the Israelis have used against Iran since the start of the operation was when Iranian opposition programming started being broadcast on Iranian satellite television when the Israeli or some force was able to uh, basically hijack the Iranian satellite television channel and start broadcasting messages that were against the regime. So, as much as the Iranians have used propaganda and fear and mind games to overwhelm their population at home to put them into a state of fear against Israel, now Israel is using similar tactics to expose the weak points in the Iranian government and to expose all of the horrible atrocities they've committed against their own people. And I think you even have a combination of this where cyber war and physical war being combined, where you had the Israeli Air Force take out the main mouthpiece for the regime by bombing the IRIB, Iranian State Broadcasting Building, 2 days ago on June 17th.
There's a lot to unpack there, Greg. I first want to talk about regime change then. What would that, let's call it transition, look like, if at all, and what scenarios may unfold there? Because I heard you talk in another podcast interview where you said that and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that the Iranians themselves have to decide their own fate, and it's not some Western imposed solution that should be put on them. So if you can elaborate on that.
Take two examples of regime change that has taken place with boots on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
One in Iraq, when U.S. soldiers occupied the country in terms of a military standing from 2003 until about 2017, 2018. And you saw the first 10 years of that led to two distinct failures of U.S. policy. The first was the de-Baathification process, where you had all elements of Iraqi governance, not just the people on top who were making pernicious decisions against their people, but the dog catcher, the sewage workers, anybody involved in state infrastructure were removed from power. And that led to the complete collapse of the Iraqi state, a failed state scenario, which then led to the ascent of Shia militias targeting U.S. troops, of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then the eventual morphing of that into the Islamic State. That's not how you do regime change. Also, if you look at a successful occupation, look at Japan post-1945. Everyone associated with the emperor, the Tojo government, others were removed from power, but they didn't get rid of the elements of state power in Japan. People were responsible. It's called the middle managers and below. You didn't vanquish the bureaucracy. Yeah, you targeted those responsible for war crimes, but everybody else still had a job after the war ended. Now, take those two models, de-Baathification and MacArthur occupation of Japan, remove U.S. soldiers from the equation, and that's what you have to get inside of Iran, where the mayors of towns, people who serve on city councils, those who are responsible for labor committees, because there's no unions in the country, those who are your doctors, your lawyers, your trash sanitation department. You can't have an expectation that there's going to be a revolutionary-like process in Iran, like what happened in post-1979 with the Islamic Revolution. You need a counter-revolution that doesn't eliminate key people from key infrastructure jobs. And in terms of the targeting packages that Israel is using against Iran, if you take out power plants, if you take out their oil refinery capabilities, if you take out their oil export capabilities, maybe you'll make that decision to put pressure onto the regime. But you have to do it in such a way where you have a controlled implosion of the state, very much like you would maybe take down an old building in the center of a city, rather than just throwing explosive material and hoping that the pieces land in your favor. So there's a disconnect right now between the Iranian opposition, which is outside the country, and the Iranian people who are inside. They share one thing, though, that's important. 80% of the Iranian people, according to the latest public opinion polls, do not have a very high opinion of their government. And the opposition, who's on the outside of the country, have many different interests. You have the Pahlavis, who support the return of the constitutional monarchy with Reza Pahlavi. You have federalists, who are maybe for a sort of a devolution of power between Iran and the different ethnic segments that are there. You have communists. You have people who are Marxists. You have those who are in favor of Kurdish autonomy or Baluchi autonomy, or the other 54% of the country, which isn't Persian. But the way to be able to connect those who are on the outside, who have been the opposition for 46 years, and those who are on the inside, is to find something in common, which is elements of state power should be excised from the Islamic Republic minders, if you will. So if you remove the Islamists from Iran, but you keep the Iranian state intact, and you invite the outside to speak with those who are on the inside, you might be able to have a successful transition of power, which will not be that violent. What I'm worried about is that if the US is involved, if Israel is involved, if there's some sort of directive to start targeting elements of state power that can't be transitioned to the people, those power plants, wastewater treatment plants, things that you rely on, even commercial and economic devices, like if you go after the Grand Bazaar or markets, that might destabilize it to the point which is uncontrollable. So, in terms of your ability to use power, either through influence operations, through targeted kinetic strikes, through more massive use of power, keep your target bank on the nuclear program, on the ballistic missile capabilities, symbols of the regime. But whatever you do, do not go after the Iranian people. And I think that if you pair that with non-kinetic coercive activities like hijacking satellite channels, bringing in Starlink, offering commercial incentives, creating strike funds, many of that I've lined out in a paper I wrote back in January, a comprehensive guide to democratic transition in Iran, then you might be able to do it the right way and not repeat the mistakes of previous American and other country interventions in states that then became failed states. So we don't want a Somalia, we don't want a Mogadishu, we don't want an Iraq. We want to have something that's controlled, that's deliberate, and that is done in such a way that it protects Israeli and American and Western interests, but doesn't jeopardize the prosperity or the potential for prosperity for the Iranian people.
I was in Iran in 2007, as I've mentioned before here on the program. And indeed, I heard at that time 70, 80% of the population just doesn't support the government. And in fact, I was there on Death to America Day in early November when that marks the anniversary of the overtake of the US Embassy. And of course, I saw all the protesters, and we were on the street. We were in a car, actually. And I remember on the street just being deluged and people walking by with all their placards and shouting Death to America. And then later that day, there was a woman that came up to me. She was a school teacher, and she was visiting one of the archaeological sites where we were with her class. And she found out I was American. We engaged in conversation. And she said, "We all say death to America, but we don't mean it." And she said that with a smile on her face. But of course, she doesn't mean it. But of course, the leadership does. Which brings me then to the question about the Grand Ayatollah. So, in this scenario where he is out of the picture, what do you think happens to him? Does he find a safe haven in Moscow, for example, or Beijing, or in Qatar? What's his fate, do you think, likely to be?
So I want to kind of do the Jewish response here and
Mm-hmm.
answer your question with the question, which is what are the elements of regime power that they rely on to capture the state?
Mm-hmm.
So the Ayatollah is on top, but he has a very deep network, which goes back to the time of the Islamic Revolution, where when Khamenei came in and took over Iran from the Shah, the Islamic Revolution started. It was a grassroots movement. Every mosque had a three-member revolution committee, which was even before Khomeiни's return. And he was at the point where, when he came back, he had a network which was established for the Iranian Revolution, for the Islamic Revolution in Iran to start percolating to the top. And those people who ran those mosque committees in every town across Iran are still in power today. So if the Ayatollah goes, Moscow, wherever else, what will come after him? Is it his son? Is it other members of the IRGC? You have this misnomer of there being hardliners and reformists in the Iranian government. It's just revolution hard, revolution heavy, and revolution right, but they're still Islamic revolutionaries. So to be able to look at how you deconstruct the regime, you have to look at those who have interests in being part of Iranian governance versus those who have personal interests in trying to manipulate and overpower the Iranian people. There's three elements here of state power you have to take out. It's not just the Ayatollah, but it's the body that elects him, the Assembly of Experts. It's 84 people who are responsible for electing the next supreme leader. You have the Guardian Council, which prevents everyday Iranians from being involved in this Islamic democracy that they've put together. Thousands of people register to run for parliament and president every election, but 99% are eliminated by the so-called guardians of the revolution. And then lastly, you have the regular Iranian government and the military. You have the Majlis, which is their parliament, all vetted by the supreme leader. And you also have those who are part of the cabinet, who are in some cases technical experts, but are largely functionaries of the revolution itself. So if you look at those three elements as being the base of power, of civilian power for the supreme leader, and you're able to deconstruct that, that's one solution. But then you also have to deal with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They exist as a military entity. Besides their missile and unconventional forces, they also have 180,000 volunteers called the Basij, which are sort of the paramilitaries that enforce revolutionary protocol in cities throughout Iran. And then parallel to that, you have the regular Iranian army. If you're 18 and you're living in Iran, you might get drafted to do service in the Iranian military. It doesn't mean that you're joining the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. You have military professionals. As you get higher up the ranks, you drink the revolutionary Kool-Aid. But if you're just a private or a sergeant or a lieutenant, you might need to have the replacement government, whatever body comes in, to look at the non-revolutionary Iranians who would be expected to take over in a transitional capacity, or which would replace the supreme leader, to be able to rely on some military elements that are not the IRGC but are regular forces. And frankly, we don't know what that looks like, and that's a question that policymakers are going to have to ask.
And just real briefly before we move on, the Iranian people themselves, as we've said, the lion's share do not support the government. And I'm just wondering, though, because they're very nationalistic, and if they see another country, Israel in this case, bombing their country, and of course they're going after military targets, not civilian targets. Where are they with this right now? Like, what's your read?
So there was a few sparse reports that
Mm-hmm.
came out from the country about civilian resistance to the regime in the first days of the bombing. The first was a jailbreak that took place with some 500 alleged drug addicts that got out of a rehabilitation clinic. And there's this video of them flooding onto the highway of Iran, trying to make their way to wherever they're going, away from the prison. There was also reports of low intensity conflict, a firefight in the city of Ray between Iranian dissidents, I guess. They could also have been a separatist group, but there's no real identification on who they were, and the Iranian government. You've also seen an uptick in activity in the Kurdish regions, the Baluchi regions, and in the Arab majority regions of Khuzestan and the Avazis, who have been starting to get on the street. But this is all in the backdrop prior to these attacks taking place of a 2 week long Iranian trucker strike,
Yeah.
where transportation in the country for the movement of goods was shut down starting from June 3rd. So if you take the trucker strike, combine it with some of these reports of instances of civil resistance, and now that the internet has gone out in Iran, it'll be a very hard read to be able to know exactly what's going on in the country, which is all the more important why elements like Starlink, communications devices, being able to speak even by land routes through the Iraqi, Armenian, Azeri, and Pakistani borders that go into Iran, to be able to get a read of what's going on. And in doing so, I think that the more that the Iranian people are disconnected from the outside world, the more incentive that they will have to rise up. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but if they feel like the government is trying to suppress something from them in terms of the news that they're getting beyond state outlets, they'll start asking questions. Why can't I go to the ATM? Why can't I fill up my car at the gas station? How come I'm not being allowed to go to work? How come the water meter inspector is not coming to read my not annual, but my monthly water usage? How come I'm having constant rolling blackouts? And the more consternation and fear and hesitation that they'll have, not as a result of Israeli strikes, but as a result of the state not being able to provide basic services, that might be your sort of catalytic event that will then lead to more people openly casting aspersions and defying the regime.
So just switching gears here, then, Greg, can we talk about sleeper cells? And I'm jumping one step ahead, actually, because assuming the US does get involved, sending in the bunker busting bombs, what should we be bracing ourselves for? Because I keep thinking about those sleeper cells, whether here in the United States or else in Western Europe.
Right. So let's go beyond the US's borders for a second and focus on countries that either only recently outlawed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or have not done that. In Vienna and Austria, This is the center of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence Services station for all Iranian intelligence activity in Europe. And just looking at the indictments from different European countries during times of peace rather than times of war, look at what they were trying to do. There was Iranian diplomats smuggling explosive devices into Iranian embassies to use against Iranian opposition leaders. There were plans for a mass bombing on a large opposition rally in Paris and another in Brussels. There was an Iranian cell that was observing and spying on the Israeli embassy and Israeli companies in Britain, according to an indictment that just came out a few weeks ago. They have active units, sleeper cells, lone wolves, whatever you want to call them, that have, even before strikes like this, planned and tried to carry out attacks against Western Jewish and Israeli targets. Now, apply that scenario to the US, where we have a very active dragnet in terms of monitoring regime influence activities in the United States, and divide it into two, one being nonviolent, the second being violent. In terms of nonviolent activities, there are many institutions in the United States that are derivative of larger global propaganda operations that the Iranian government has launched, whether that's Shia mosques that have an affiliation with the government in Tehran, whether it's organizations like Ahl Beit. Imagine an evil version of the Jewish agency, but for the dissemination and the proliferation of Islamic revolutionary ideals beyond Iran's borders. Ahl Beit is the chief propaganda and revolutionary messaging mechanism for the clerics in Qom, which is where the revolution started, and for the government and the Supreme Leader's office. There's chapters of Ahl Beit in the United States. They have had rallies in Dearborn. They have had a protest activity against Israel in Texas last year as part of the campus protests. And I can be sure that the FBI and others are monitoring them, but they are putting forward, for right now at least, nonviolent messaging supporting the regime. Then you go from the nonviolent perspective and you go over to violent attempts to target Americans. More specifically, at least in terms of what we've seen from intelligence reports, is attempts to target Iranian opposition leaders and American officials and previous officials in the United States. There's a reason why John Bolton, Brian Hook, Mike Pompeo, and other national security leaders during the first Trump administration had Secret Service details assigned to them, because the Secret Service thought there was an active enough threat in terms of them potentially being the victims of Iranian assassination attempts to have a Secret Service detail. Add to that the two attempts on President Trump's life, not those that were the shooting on the golf course or the shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania, where his ear was grazed, but other attempts that were directly tied back to the Al-Quds force, which is the overseas terror arm of the Revolutionary Guards. Add to that 2 indictments in New York for kidnapping attempts, and another indictment for an assassination attempt against a very prominent leader of the women's section of the Iranian opposition, Masih Alinejad, which led to convictions in federal courts. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be Iranians that are principally going to be at the tip of the spear of these attacks. The Iranians have a history of hiring others, whether it's Uzbekis or Turkmen or Pakistanis, as was the attempt in Athens last year to bomb the Chabad in Athens, to hire henchmen to carry out their attacks. So yes, there should be a heightened level of vigilance and a heightened level of security for Jewish community institutions, Israeli embassies, but also for just American institutions writ large. Because while we know about those who are active here, what's more concerning are those who may have slipped past the screen and who may be capable of doing some of these attacks. But a heightened level of vigilance, a heightened level of SIGINT, of being able to monitor what's going on in Farsi and other communications. And I think quickly finishing the job in Tehran will make Americans, Israelis, members of the Jewish community, Iranian oppositionists more secure. But you can definitely be sure that there's a heightened level of supervision and watch right now from our domestic intelligence and law enforcement bodies.
Yeah, to underscore the point that should anything happen in the future with all of these sleeper cells and all the proxies, what you're saying is it's nothing new because it's already been happening.
It's been happening. They'll just have a renewed air of not confidence, but of motivation.
Right. And that's why we all have to be vigilant. So at the end of the day, really, what do you say to Americans on the left, on the right, who say we shouldn't go in?
You can delay the problem, but you're never going to get rid of it until you're willing to take action. There was a quote that came from Lindsey Graham in the 10-year review of America's presence in Afghanistan in 2011. It was a congressional blue ribbon panel looking at U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. He said, the lesson from 9/11 is that if we don't deal with the problem there, it'll eventually become our problem here. Iran has been responsible for the deaths of thousands of Americans, not just in Iraq, but in Lebanon and other areas across the rest of the world where they have even been responsible for kidnapping American diplomats and intelligence operators, brutally torturing them on television just to get their ideological goals across. They've sponsored dozens of bodies, both state and non-state bodies, which have threatened and killed Americans. This has nothing to do necessarily with U.S. support for Israel, but when you were going through that anti-America day in 2007, and you ran into a lady who said, I said that to America that I don't mean it. Well, there is a significant minority of the population who does mean it.
Yeah.
And they carry out on that threat. So if you want to remove an existential threat, not existential, but a strategic threat to America's presence and role in the world, taking the regime off the chessboard will only make Americans more safe in the long run. Doesn't mean that there's not going to be threats. Doesn't mean that there's not going to be events. But by doing that, you're delaying the inevitable. And it'll be much worse if you don't act now.
Well, I've also invoked Chairman Mao in the program before. One of my favorite expressions from him is political power grows from the barrel of a gun. And certainly the teacher, the woman that I met, doesn't have a gun in her hand. It's the minority that has the gun in their hands. And so they're the ones that are really in control of everything. So I agree 10,000%. I'm super mindful of the time. We don't have a lot of time right now. And so I'm just wondering if you can just, in really, really broad brushstrokes, Gregg, share the European response and the Arab nations around Israel and around Iran's response to all of this, because they've come out with proclamations and so on. At least the Arab states have, condemning Israel bombing. That's on the face of it, but behind the scenes, I'd have to imagine that they're actually applauding Israel.
We can go region by region.
Yeah.
So I think the notable exception of Arab states that have not condemned the Israeli bombing of Iran is Syria. There's an open check between Syria and Iran for Iran's decades-long intervention against Syria's opposition movements. It doesn't mean that President Giuliani is Netanyahu's new best friend, but the fact that they are silent in the wake of Israel carrying out efforts to stop the nuclear program, stop the ballistic missile capabilities, and go after the proxies is indicative of Giuliani being aware that those proxies didn't just target Israelis. They also went after members of his group and the Syrian Sunni majority. In terms of the Abraham Accord countries, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, to a lesser extent, Morocco, Sudan is involved in a civil war right now, so they're not necessarily relevant, but they have been calling for diplomacy. Yes, they've condemned, but they're trying to pursue a diplomatic solution. In terms of non-Abraham Accords Arab countries and other Muslim countries, I think the biggest winner here, who has still condemned the attacks, but realizes that he's going to be the ultimate victor in the long run, is Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He is now seeing the Shia expansion project collapse and inviting the Sunni Islamist Muslim Brotherhood alliance of Turkey, Pakistan, and Qatar taking over the areas where the Iranians have lost influence. So the fall of Iran is a net gain for Turkey and for the henchmen in Ankara. In terms of Europe, I think that you have sort of a split between the Visegrad countries, that's Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, more Eastern Europe, Slavic countries, and to a certain extent, Greece and Cyprus, that understand that Iran is knocking on Southeast Europe's door. And they're providing both logistics and, I won't say intelligence support, but transportation support to Israeli civilian aircraft in terms of a place to be able to land, in terms of hosting Israelis who are now having a hard time getting back home. But when it comes to the big three in Europe, Germany, France, and the UK, or maybe if you want to do an EU 3+1 and include Italy in that assessment, I see France now groveling before the Ayatollahs, trying to enter into negotiations, which are set to take place on June 20th. And I'm sure when your listeners eventually get to this episode, we'll see the failed results of their engagement with Tehran another time. Because the difference between the Europeans engaging with Iran versus the US engaging with Iran is the Europeans do it from a point of weakness, wherein the US does it through a point of strength. Look at the rhetoric coming from both sides. President Trump demands unconditional surrender, no nuclear program, Cryatollah, even giving nicknames to the supreme leader. And except for the notable statements by the Chancellor of Germany, who should be applauded for the way in which he's addressing the conflict, Sturmer, Macron, and other European leaders are trying to pursue the time-tested, failed strategy of equivocation with Iran. And they're not offering anything else besides maybe a weak sanctions package to act as the anvil to the negotiations hammer. It's important to note the statements, though, by the Chancellor of Germany, where he says in a German state television broadcast, an interview he gave them 2 or 3 days ago, so either on June 16th or 17th, Israel is doing the West's dirty work as it relates to Iran. And Germany is in lockstep cooperation, providing support to Israel militarily in terms of armaments, in terms of resupply, and logistics. And I think what Germany, or at least its leadership, sees right now is Israel making sure that it takes actions to prevent a repeat of what happened from 1933 to 1945. And Germany stands in Israel's defense.
Fascinating. And the final piece of geography is China, if you can weigh in, because they've been providing assistance to Iran.
Right. So China has had 4 elements of support for Iran, both before this and during this operation, that are of note. And for one key reason, the fuel and the technology that Iran uses to mix solid fuel and liquid fuel to propel its missiles comes from Chinese mixers that were recently destroyed in the October 2024 Israeli attack against Iran in response to Iran's attack against Israel. Secondarily, the raw inputs to make that fuel, not diesel or any hydrocarbon resources, but the chemicals needed to make it, was blown up in Bandar Abbas in the Iranian port when a Chinese shipment came, dropped off the materials before it was moved to the mixing factory. It somehow just miraculously exploded without any Israeli attribution, but we can assume who was maybe responsible for that. China also has supplied Iran with some of their anti-air systems, which are now no longer on the board, and maybe they're trying to supply that too. But lastly, China has given direct foreign currency to Iran because of the purchase of Iranian oil. So 90% of unrefined Iranian oil and natural gas goes directly to China through refineries which have been set up not as part of the Western energy matrix, which other Chinese companies are part of, but largely for the ability to import oil at a much discounted rate of $4 to $5 a barrel versus now the price is $70, $80 a barrel. And I think if China loses that, they may have to seek other sources of energy. But China, in this case, is playing the long game. They're not sending the Chinese Navy to Karg Island, which is one of the main export facilities, to say, Israel, don't strike here or we'll deal with China. And the same can be said for the Russians. They're not providing military support. Because I don't think that the Chinese and the Russians want to be on the wrong end of the U.S. military intervention in Iran if it comes to that. And frankly, they both have their own separate interests with Israel. So that's all being taken into account.
Greg, final question before we wrap. I could speak to you for hours, actually. I know that you have to get back to work. Is there one thing that has surprised you during the last, let's say, 2 weeks in this whole affair?
I think that the quicker collapse of the woke right and how fast they have turned on President Trump. That's Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Dave Smith, those who have been claiming to carry the banner of American isolationists. On the pundit side, we already mentioned them, but also other think tanks like Defense Priorities, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and how the Republican Party and some Democrats have rallied around the idea that Iran has to be dealt with now and the threat can no longer be prolonged. I mean, if you look at polls, there was one that came out today, June 19th, that said 49% of the American people support a strike against Iran, 46% are against it. But in that 49%, you see a group that overwhelmingly at least supports Israel's right to strike Iran and that don't believe that this will lead to World War III. And I think that all the warnings, all these false positive declarations about the danger to the United States are wrong because the president realizes that this is a danger. Most in Congress realize this is a danger, and those who were crying wolf are now being excised to the far left and far rights of their parties. And I think the nation will come together to address this. That's what surprised me, how quick it took for individuals like Carlson and Owens and others to collapse and to be ran over by the more mainstream elements within their political factions.
Fascinating. Well, listen, Gregg Roman, we're going to leave it right there. Again, I could speak to you all day on this, but I know that you have to get back to work. So we just want to thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of IsraelCast. And as I mentioned to you before we started rolling, I feel like I'm going to have you on 12,000 more times to talk about the region. And hopefully next time you're on, we'll have peace and good news to share. So once again, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. And we'll have info about Gregg on the show notes page of our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. And as I said at the top of the show, don't forget to rate and review us because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast, and we're also on YouTube, like I said, so do check us out there. Just search for IsraelCast. And one more point of housekeeping, of course, that we do want to thank all the folks behind the scenes to make IsraelCast happen. As I call it, it's our mini Moshav, and we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, and our editor, who's Jay Rothman. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say hello, I'd love to hear from you. So do email us at IsraelCast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.